the sea. But if you're talking about what we call eustatic changes of sea, worldwide changes of sea, that's through the thermal expansion of the oceans, nothing to do with melting ice. And that would take a very long time, more than your or my lifetime, even to be able to detect it.
It is also suggested that a rise in temperature will lead to the spread northward of deadly insect-borne tropical diseases like malaria. But is this true? Professor Paul Reiter of the Pasteur Institute in Paris is recognized as one of the world's leading experts on malaria and other insect-borne diseases. He is a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee, was chairman of the American Committee of Medical Entomology of the American Society for Tropical Medicine, and lead author on the health section of the US National Assessment of the Potential Consequences of Climate Variability.
Mosquitoes are not specifically tropical. Most people will realize that in temperate regions there are mosquitoes. In fact, mosquitoes are extremely abundant in the Arctic. The most devastating epidemic of malaria was in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. There were something like 13 million cases a year and something like 600,000 deaths. A tremendous catastrophe that reached up to the Arctic Circle. Archangel had 30,000 cases and about 10,000 deaths. So it's not a tropical disease. Yet these people in the global warming fraternity invent the idea that malaria will move northwards.
Official reports issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are often very alarming. But how reliable are they?
I was horrified to read the second and the third assessment reports because there was so much misinformation without any kind of recourse or virtually without mention of the scientific literature, the truly scientific literature, the literature by specialists in those fields.
In a letter to the Wall Street Journal, Professor Frederick Seitz, former president of America's National Academy of Sciences, revealed that IPCC officials had censored the comments of scientists. He said that
this report is not the version that was approved by the contributing scientists.
At least 15 key sections of the science chapter had been deleted. These included statements like,
none of the studies cited has shown clear evidence that we can attribute climate changes to increases in greenhouse gases. No study to date has positively attributed all or part of the observed climate changes to man-made causes.
Professor Seitz concluded,
I have never witnessed a more disturbing corruption of the peer review process than the events that led to this IPCC report.
In its reply, the IPCC did not deny making these deletions, but it said there was no dishonesty or bias in the report and that uncertainties about the cause of global warming had been included. The changes had been made, it said, in response to comments from governments, individual scientists, and non-governmental organizations.
When I resigned from the IPCC, I thought that was the end of it. But when I saw the final draft, my name was still there, so I asked for it to be removed. Well, they told me that I had contributed, so it would remain there. So I said, no, I haven't contributed because they haven't listened to anything I've said. So in the end, it was quite a battle. But finally, I threatened legal action against them, and they removed my name. And I think this happens a great deal. Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
There is now a powerful institutional momentum behind the idea of man-made global warming. Here in Nairobi, dedicated civil servants, professional NGO campaigners, carbon offset fund managers, environmental journalists and others have gathered for a 10-day conference sponsored by the UN to discuss climate change. The number of delegates exceeds 6,000.
Where I live, we have a local council global warming officer. There's a huge tail out there of people who have, in one way or another, been recruited to join this particular bandwagon.
The billions of dollars invested in climate science means there is a huge constituency of people dependent upon those dollars. And they will want to see that carry forward. It happens in any bureaucracy.
Anybody who stands up and says, hey, wait a minute, let's look at this coolly and rationally and carefully and see actually how much merit, how much this stands up, they will be ostracized.
The old English saying, if you stand up in the coconut shy, they're going to throw at you. So I understand that there's going to be some of that, but it gets pretty difficult and pretty nasty and very personal. And it's been, death threats and all sorts of things. And so I'm not doing it for my health.
These days, if you're skeptical about the litany around climate change, you're suddenly like as if you're a Holocaust denier.
I'm certainly not the first or the last person to say that the whole global warming business has become like a religion. And people who disagree are called heretics. I'm a heretic. The makers of this program are all heretics.
The environmental movement, really, it is a political activist movement. And they have become hugely influential at a global level. And every politician is aware of that today. Whether you're on the left, in the middle, or the right, you have to pay homage to the environment.
The global warming campaign recently won a great victory. The United States government, once a bastion of resistance, has succumbed. George Bush is now an ally. Western governments have now embraced the need for international agreements to restrain industrial production in the developed and developing world. But at what cost? Paul Driesen is a former environmental campaigner.
My big concern with global warming is that the policies being pushed to supposedly prevent global warming are having a disastrous effect on the world's poorest people.
Global warming campaigners say it does no harm to be on the safe side. Even if the theory of man-made climate change is wrong, we should impose draconian measures to cut carbon emissions just in case. They call this the precautionary principle.
The precautionary principle is a very interesting beast. It's basically used to promote a particular agenda and ideology. It's always used in one direction only. It talks about the risks of using a particular technology, fossil fuels, for example, but never about the risks of not using it. It never talks about the benefits of having that technology.
Anne Moore-Geller is about to cook a meal for her children. She is one of the 2 billion people, a third of the world's population, who have no access to electricity. Instead, they must burn wood or animal dung in their homes. The indoor smoke this produces is the deadliest form of pollution in the world. Nor do people like Anne have access to clean water. As a result, around 4 million children under the age of 5 die in poor countries each year from respiratory diseases and diarrhea.
If you were to ask a rural person to define development, they'll tell you, yes, I know I've moved to the next level when I have electricity. Actually, not having electricity creates such a long chain of problems because the first thing you miss is the light. So you get that they have to go to sleep earlier because there's no light. There's no reason to stay awake. I mean, you can't talk to each other in darkness.
No refrigeration or modern packaging means that food cannot be kept. A fire in the hut is too smoky and consumes too much wood to be used as heating. There is no hot water. We in the West cannot begin to imagine how hard life is without electricity. The life expectancy of people who live like this is terrifyingly short. Their existence impoverished in every way. A few miles away, the UN is hosting its conference on global warming in its plush-gated headquarters. The gift shop is selling souvenirs of peasant tribal life, while delegates discuss how to promote what are described as sustainable forms of electrical generation. Africa has coal, and Africa has oil, but environmental groups are campaigning against the use of these cheap sources of energy. Instead, they say Africa and the rest of the Third World should use solar and wind power. A short drive out of Nairobi, we find our first solar panel. A Kenyan public health official has brought us to a clinic which serves several villages. The only electrical implements in the clinic are the electric lights and a refrigerator in which to keep vaccines, medicine and blood samples. Electricity is provided by 2 solar panels.
So what can it do successfully?
Lighting.
Lighting only.
Yes.
What happens when you put lighting plus the refrigerator and others? What happens?
It sounds an alarm.
It sounds an alarm?
Yeah.
Then can we maybe see that?
The solar panels allow Dr. Samuel Mwangi to use either the lights or the refrigerator, but not both at the same time. If he does, the electricity shuts down. Wind and solar power are notoriously unreliable as a source of electricity and are at least 3 times more expensive than conventional forms of electrical generation.
The question would be, how many people in Europe, how many people in the United States are already using that kind of energy? And how cheap is it? You see, if it's expensive for the Europeans, if it's expensive for the Americans, and we are talking about poor Africans, it doesn't make sense. The rich countries can afford to engage in some luxurious experimentation with other forms of energy. But for us, we are still at the stage of survival.
To former environmentalist Paul Driesen, the idea that the world's poorest people should be restricted to using the world's most expensive and inefficient forms of electrical generation is the most morally repugnant aspect of the global warming campaign.
Let me make one thing perfectly clear. If we're telling the third world that they can only have wind and solar power, what we are really telling them is you cannot have electricity.
The challenge we have when we meet Western environmentalists who say we must engage in use of solar panels and wind energy is how we can have Africa industrialized. Because I don't see how a solar panel is going to power a steel industry, how a solar panel is going to power maybe some railway train network. It might work maybe to power a small transistor radio. One clear thing that emerges from the whole environmental debate is the point that there's somebody keen to kill the African dream, and the African dream is to develop.
The environmental movement has evolved into the strongest force there is for preventing development in the developing countries.
We are being told, don't touch your resource, don't touch your oil, don't touch your coal. That is suicide.
I think it's legitimate for me to call them anti-human. Like, okay, you don't have to think humans are better than whales or better than owls or whatever if you don't want to, right? But surely it is not a good idea to think of humans as sort of being scum. That it's okay to have hundreds of millions of them go blind or die or whatever. I just can't relate to that.
The theory of man-made global warming is now so firmly entrenched, the voices of opposition so effectively silenced, it seems invincible, untroubled by any contrary evidence, no matter how strong. The global warming alarm is now beyond reason.
There will still be people who believe that this is the end of the world, particularly when you have, for example, the chief scientist of the UK telling people that by the end of the century, the only habitable place on the Earth will be the Antarctic. And humanity may survive thanks to some breeding couples who move to the Antarctic. I mean, it's hilarious. It would be hilarious, actually, if it weren't so sad.
What's tomorrow's weather? What's the law? What's the harm? Will it be wet?